What would you do if your neighbor tried to seize control of your home, weaponize the HOA, and call the cops on you, just because you refused to open your pool at 4 a.m.? Sounds ridiculous, right? Well, it happened to me. And that was only the beginning. This isn't just another Karen story. This is the true, twisted tale of how a seemingly harmless HOA president and her corrupt officer husband turned a quiet neighborhood into a battleground of intimidation, lies, wrongful arrest, and a cover-up that reached all the way into city law enforcement. They came for my house. They came for my rights. They even called me a domestic terrorist. But what they didn't count on was me fighting back. With cameras. With evidence. With the law. What followed was a firestorm of legal battles, viral outrage, courtroom showdowns, and a nationwide reckoning on what happens when community rules are used to crush the very people they claim to protect. This is a story about resistance. About justice. And about how one man's refusal to be silenced exposed an empire of corruption. Clapperboard, you're not going to believe how this ends. Backhand index pointing down, comment below and tell us, where are you watching from? Thumbs up, smash that like button if you've ever had a crazy neighbor. Bell, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter in this wild, true saga. Outbox Stray, and don't forget to share this video, because everyone needs to know how far a Karen can go when no one's watching. And what happens when someone finally does. It was 4:02 a.m. when the doorbell shattered the silence. I jolted awake, groggy and disoriented. The world outside was still cloaked in darkness, not even the robins had begun to sing. I threw on a hoodie and trudged downstairs, thinking maybe it was an emergency. Someone must have broken down on the road. Or maybe there'd been a fire. I wasn't expecting Karen. Clad in a designer robe, hair tied in a perfectly preserved bun, standing in the glow of my porch light with a clipboard in one hand and entitlement in the other. Beside her, towering like a rusting water tank, stood her husband, Deputy Frank Hutchinson. Red-faced, guts spilling over his belt, hands resting casually near his holster like he was waiting for an excuse to use it. And leaning against the porch railing with all the energy of a teenager who hated everything, their son Riley, half asleep and devouring a cold slice of pizza. Behind them sat 3 enormous suitcases, gleaming under the porch light like polished monuments of bad intentions. "Mr. Washington," Karen said sharply, checking her clipboard like she was conducting a census instead of knocking on my door before dawn. "We need to speak with you." I blinked. "Good morning to you too, Karen. It's 4 o'clock. Is something wrong?" "My sister's home in Florida got hit by that hurricane last week," she began, in a voice that managed to sound both sugary and cold. "She and her family need a place to stay for the next month while the repairs are done. Since you've got the biggest house on the block, and since you live alone, the HOA board has unanimously decided your place is the most suitable." I laughed. Not the polite kind. The tired, stunned, am I dreaming, kind. "Wait. So you're saying you want me to open my house to strangers I've never met, and this has already been decided without even asking me?" According to HOA Bylaw 247B, Karen said with the smug finality of someone who lives to quote rules out of context, residents are required to provide assistance during neighborhood emergencies. Frank stepped forward then, his meaty hand brushing his belt, eyes narrowing. "It's the right thing to do, son." I kept my voice calm. "I'm 34 years old, not your son. And let me make one thing clear, I bought this home with my own money. My name's on the deed. This isn't up for discussion." Karen's smile faltered like a vinyl fence in high wind. "We hoped you'd be more cooperative. You have until tomorrow morning to reconsider. After that, we'll explore all available options for community enforcement." As they loaded their luggage back into their SUV, Riley turned and muttered, "Nice house. Gonna be even nicer when we're living in it." That was the moment I knew, this wasn't a request. It was a declaration of war. The sun hadn't yet kissed the rooftops when I saw their car roll by again. I was sipping coffee on my porch, hoping yesterday's 4 a.m. stunt was just another HOA fever dream. But there it was again, Karen's silver Lexus crawling past my house like it was part of a surveillance detail. Inside, she was on the phone, waving her hand furiously. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but it didn't take a genius to guess. By 8 a.m., I had 3 missed calls from the HOA's Community Emergency Response Liaison. A title that, until this moment, I assumed Karen invented. By 10 a.m., a letter had been taped to my front door. This is a formal notice from the HOA Emergency Housing Committee. Per HOA Bylaw 247B, failure to comply with designated emergency housing assignments will result in escalated community enforcement measures. I laughed. Out loud. Alone. Then I set up my security cameras. At noon, there was a knock at the door. Predictably, it was Officer Frank Hutchinson. He wasn't in uniform, but he didn't need it to try intimidation. The badge was always in his eyes. "Jerome," he began, voice calm but calculated, "we want to resolve this peacefully." "I bet you do," I replied, not bothering to invite him in. Karen was standing behind him, arms folded and face flushed from either rage or too much sun. Her son, Riley, stayed in the car, filming something with his phone. "This isn't about you," Frank continued. "It's about helping people in need. You've got extra space. Your refusal put strain on the entire neighborhood." "Funny," I said, "I don't recall the neighborhood volunteering my guest room." "You're refusing a lawful community directive," Karen barked. "No. I'm refusing a power trip dressed up as a policy," I answered. Frank stepped closer. "Be smart, Jerome. Don't make us escalate this." And there it was. The threat. I filed a report that same afternoon. Not that I expected it to go anywhere. But I wanted a paper trail. I also forwarded the HOA's letter to a civil rights attorney I knew from college, Marcus Chen. We hadn't spoken in years, but Marcus responded within the hour, "Record everything. And don't answer the door without a witness." That night, I didn't sleep. Every time a car passed, I checked my phone. My cameras. My doors. At 6:03 a.m., I woke up to a pounding knock, and the sound of 3 squad cars outside. Frank was back. This time, in uniform. 2 other officers flanked him. "Jerome Washington, you're under arrest for obstruction of emergency housing procedures, threatening a public official, and disorderly conduct." I stood still, heart racing. "You're kidding. You have the right to remain silent," he started reciting. I turned to grab my phone, when one of the other officers tackled me from behind. I hit the ground hard. Face first. My coffee mug shattered across the porch. Karen stood at the edge of the sidewalk. Smiling. At the station, they booked me. No phone call. No explanation. Just paperwork, cold benches, and sideways stares. By noon, they transferred me to county holding. That's when I learned the charges had been exaggerated to include domestic terrorism, due to the threats Frank claimed I made while resisting. He said I had a history of confrontational behavior, and was on the verge of radicalizing. All of it fiction. Fabricated from thin air. But they treated it as gospel. I spent 2 weeks in that facility. No visitors. No bail hearing. No contact with the outside world. Meanwhile, Karen and Frank were holding HOA meetings about protecting the neighborhood from hostile actors. Neighbors who used to wave now looked away. Riley posted TikToks of my empty lawn with captions like, "Problem solved," and "Neighborhood finally safe again." I was buried. Forgotten. Until Marcus showed up. Marcus Chen walked into the county jail with the calm of someone who had fought too many battles to flinch. He wore a gray suit, a messenger bag slung over one shoulder, and a confidence that made the correctional officer at the front desk suddenly sit up straighter. "Jerome Washington," he said flatly. "I'm here for my client." 2 hours later, I was in a visiting room, shackled but alive. Marcus placed a stack of documents on the table, pushed his glasses up, and gave me a look that was somewhere between disbelief and fury. "You look like hell," he said. "I feel like it too," I muttered. "They're saying I'm a terrorist." "Yeah. I saw the charges. Don't worry. We're going to turn this entire circus upside down." He opened his folder and laid out a timeline. In the last 48 hours, he'd compiled footage from my security cameras, matched timestamps with police dispatch logs, and even reached out to local journalists who'd started sniffing around the story. The Hutchinsons had overplayed their hand. "What they did was more than illegal," Marcus said. "It was tactical. They used HOA policy as a front to force you out. And the way Frank escalated it? That's abuse of power on a criminal level." "What do we do next?" I asked. "We start flipping the script." Marcus filed a motion for immediate release based on wrongful arrest. He had video evidence showing no threats, no obstruction, no grounds for terrorism charges. The judge, a tired man who barely glanced up from the paperwork, granted it with a sigh. Within 36 hours, I walked out of that place. But the neighborhood I came back to wasn't the one I remembered. Karen had put up new signs outside the HOA clubhouse. "Neighborhood watch in effect, zero tolerance for hostile behavior." A security patrol car idled outside my driveway every night. Trash cans appeared tipped over on my lawn. Someone egged my car. But I wasn't alone anymore. Marcus and I went door to door, speaking with neighbors. Some shut their doors. But others, quiet, tired people who dealt with Karen's HOA tyranny in silence, began to talk. "Mr. Delaney, 3 houses down," said Karen once threatened to fine him $1,000 for installing solar panels without written permission, even though the city had already approved it. A young couple who just moved in said Frank pulled them over in their own driveway for suspicious behavior. Marcus compiled every testimony, every screenshot, every video. We were building a case not just for my name, but for a class action. Then came the break. One morning, I checked my front porch and found a sealed envelope. Inside was a USB drive, and a single line written on a yellow post-it, "You didn't hear this from me." I plugged it in. What I found shook me. Bodycam footage. From Frank's own chest rig. Audio files. Text exchanges between him and Karen. It wasn't just about me. They had done this before. To a veteran. To a widowed mother. To a retiree who refused to join a voluntary HOA project. One clip showed Frank saying, "We push them hard enough, they crack or leave. Either way, we win." Another showed Karen discussing ways to manipulate the HOA's emergency clause to deal with troublemakers. The footage was damning. Marcus reached out to Officer Leah Williams, a rising star at the local precinct known for her ethics and for quietly resisting the good old boy culture. She agreed to meet us at a neutral location. At the diner, she listened silently as Marcus laid out what we had. When we played Frank's audio, her jaw clenched. "I always suspected," she said. "But I didn't have proof." "You do. Will you help us?" Marcus asked. "Yes," she said. "And I'm not the only one." That week, local media picked up the story. Then national outlets came knocking. CNN. ProPublica. Even Netflix expressed interest in a documentary. Frank was placed on leave. Karen was temporarily suspended from the HOA presidency pending an ethics investigation. But the board. largely made up of her friends, was dragging their feet. So Marcus turned the heat up. He filed a federal civil rights lawsuit. He named Frank, Karen, the HOA board, and even the precinct itself for complicity. More whistleblowers emerged. HOA financial irregularities. Embezzlement. Nepotism. Frank's years of misconduct reports that mysteriously vanished from the precinct system. The case was now larger than me. It had become a reckoning. But Karen didn't go quietly. She staged a press conference on the steps of City Hall, calling herself a victim of cancel culture and radical activism. Her speech went viral for all the wrong reasons. In one breath, she claimed to support diversity. In the next, she referred to my home as a destabilizing element in a formerly peaceful neighborhood. The backlash was immediate. Sponsors pulled support from HOA community events. Karen's real estate license was suspended. Riley was expelled from school for cyberbullying. The Hutchinson empire was crumbling. Still, we weren't done. Marcus discovered emails, leaked by a former HOA secretary, showing that Karen and Frank had been coordinating to illegally approve HOA policy changes without majority votes. One thread even included an attempt to fake signatures from residents who had moved away. The more we dug, the worse it got. We now had video and audio proof of harassment, false charges and fabricated police reports, HOA corruption and financial abuse, whistleblower testimony, and a mountain of community support. We were ready to go to court. But first, Marcus had one final move. He reached out to the Department of Justice. Not just as a civil case. As a pattern and practice investigation. 3 months after my release, our case became the foundation of a federal probe into systemic abuse in HOA communities and small-town law enforcement structures. Marcus testified before Congress. I gave interviews on 60 Minutes and PBS. A new bill, the Fair Community Protection Act, was introduced with bipartisan support. People I'd never met sent letters. Donated to the legal fund. Shared their own horror stories. What began as Karen's 4 a.m. demand had become something unstoppable. A movement. Part 4, Public Exposure. The courthouse was buzzing long before sunrise. Media vans lined the sidewalk. Microphones dangled from booms. Protesters and supporters clustered into opposite corners, holding signs. Some read, "Justice for Jerome." Others, funded by Karen's dwindling allies, screamed, "Don't criminalize community protection." Inside, the courtroom was packed. The judge, a woman named Justice Leah Cardozo, had a no-nonsense reputation. She walked in, banged her gavel once, and the trial of the Hutchinsons, Frank and Karen, officially began. Marcus stood, poised and steady. On our side sat a team of civil rights lawyers, experts in housing discrimination, and community advocates. Karen, in a cream pantsuit that tried hard to scream innocence, whispered to her legal team. Frank sat with his jaw locked, eyes downcast. This wasn't just about me anymore. The charges included false arrest and malicious prosecution, HOA fraud and financial misconduct, civil rights violations, abuse of authority, obstruction of justice. Marcus began by walking the court through a timeline. He presented videos of my arrest, my treatment in jail, and the series of events that unfolded around it. When the court saw the footage of Officer Frank lying under oath and the body cam audio where he said, "Push them hard enough, they leave," a wave of murmurs rippled through the room. But Marcus didn't stop there. He introduced witnesses, the young couple who had been pulled over in their driveway. The retiree who'd been fined for not attending a mandatory HOA brunch. And Officer Williams, who testified under oath about the toxic protection racket run by Frank and covered by HOA influence. Then came the financials. Karen had been rerouting funds meant for neighborhood safety into HOA consulting projects that just so happened to contract her cousin's security firm. Her embezzlement totaled over $85,000 across 3 years. The paper trail was airtight. She couldn't squirm away. Frank's history of misconduct, nearly a dozen citizen complaints, including excessive force, false stops, and threats, had all been buried in internal reviews, until now. Karen's defense team tried to reframe it all. These were isolated misinterpretations. HOA guidelines were vague. Our clients were only acting in the best interest of the neighborhood. Justice Cardozo wasn't buying it. Neither was the public. Social media exploded. Hashtags like #HOAHorror and #Jerome vs. Karen trended for weeks. The press aired nightly breakdowns of the trial's progress. Talk shows debated small-town power and systemic bias. Even comedians got involved. One late-night host joked, "When your HOA thinks it's the FBI, you know something's gone full Karen." Meanwhile, neighbors who had once stayed silent came forward. More stories. More abuse. Karen's house was egged, then vandalized with paint. Frank's patrol car was photographed abandoned near a liquor store, reeking of neglect. But Marcus warned, "We don't win by sinking to their level. We win by letting the truth shine." And shine it did. The verdict came after 4 days of deliberation. Guilty. On all major counts. Frank Hutchinson was convicted of perjury, obstruction, and civil rights violations. Karen, of embezzlement, HOA fraud, and conspiracy to violate constitutional protections. Sentencing was swift, 7 years for Frank, 5 for Karen, plus community service and restitution. But it didn't end there. Justice Cardozo made a rare ruling: both were permanently barred from holding positions of power in any HOA, civil committee, or law enforcement agency in the state. The courtroom gasped. So did I. That same day, the Hutchinsons' assets were frozen pending civil settlement. Their Lexus was repossessed in real time by a marshal, right outside the courthouse. Riley, their son, posted an angry live stream that ended with police escorting him off school property. Marcus had one last play. He filed a motion for structured settlement, public apology, full financial damages, and mandatory service hours in communities they had discriminated against. The judge approved every term. 2 months later, Karen and Frank stood on the steps of the same courthouse in front of a small podium. They were forced to read a statement broadcast live. "We, Karen and Frank Hutchinson, acknowledge the abuse of our authority, and the harm we caused Jerome Washington and others. We apologize to our community, and to every person impacted by our actions. We commit to restitution and to never again hold positions of power in any governing body." I stood in the front row. Not to forgive. Not to forget. To witness. The apology went viral. Millions watched. More importantly, thousands were inspired to challenge unfair HOA rules, to demand transparency from their boards, and to investigate harassment masked as neighborhood safety. The pressure triggered statewide HOA reform. By year's end, a new law was passed, the Community Accountability Act, ensuring HOA meetings must be recorded, financials disclosed quarterly, and all bylaw changes require 70% resident approval. Karen's downfall had triggered a revolution. And Jerome Washington? I finally stepped back into my home without fear. The egg stains on the siding had been cleaned. But I left one mark near the mailbox, a single mural of a lion, painted in bold golds and blacks. Not to mark victory. To mark survival. The courtroom was still echoing with the judge's gavel when Marcus turned to me and said, "Now comes the part they never expect, consequences." Frank and Karen had been sentenced, stripped of their titles, and humiliated in public, but Marcus wasn't done. He filed a civil motion for financial restitution. Not just for me, but for every single victim of their abuse. We gathered names. Dozens. The retiree fined for a lawn chair. The single mother threatened with eviction. The disabled veteran who was denied access to the community clubhouse because his wheelchair was labeled a fire hazard. The judge agreed to a group settlement. It totaled $1.52 million in damages, to be paid out from the Hutchinsons' assets, which were already frozen. Frank's pension seized. Karen's real estate firm liquidated. Their Lexus, their vacation property in Aspen, the HOA's emergency fund, that had been mysteriously rerouted to a personal offshore account, gone. The court-appointed receiver sold off their belongings to cover the payout. But Marcus had one more clause in mind: public accountability. He insisted on a mandatory restitution program. Not just paying damages, but serving time in the communities they harmed. Karen would spend 12 months volunteering in a racial justice housing nonprofit in Baltimore. Frank would be required to work as an unarmed security staffer at a shelter for formerly incarcerated citizens in Detroit. No weapons. No titles. Just humility. They resisted. Their lawyers begged for leniency. But the judge wasn't swayed. "This isn't vengeance," she said in her ruling. "It's correction through exposure. You will look people in the eye, the same people you tried to erase, and you will serve them." Meanwhile, I went home. The HOA board collapsed. With Karen gone and Frank disgraced, 3 members resigned in a single week. A reform team was voted in. New bylaws were drafted with resident input. Cameras were installed in meetings. HOA funds were published online monthly. It wasn't perfect. But it was better. One day, I walked past Karen's old house. It had a new coat of paint. A new family. A mixed-race couple with a toddler learning to walk in the yard. The mailbox bore a new name. The air felt different. Not clean, but clearing. In the weeks that followed, Marcus and I were invited to speak at conferences. Civil rights forums. College campuses. Local councils. Our story became a case study: how small abuses of power can fester into full-blown persecution if left unchecked. A documentary crew followed us for months. The film, HOA, Power, Privilege, and Pushback, debuted at Sundance and went viral on Netflix within weeks. I never thought I'd be in a documentary. But there I was, just a guy who didn't want to open his pool at 4 a.m., now representing thousands who had no voice. A year later, I stood at the same courthouse, this time for the final chapter. The Hutchinsons, now stripped of all influence, delivered a second apology. It was quieter. No cameras. Just a courtroom of victims, lawyers, and a judge who had seen it all. Karen's voice trembled. Frank couldn't look anyone in the eye. They asked for forgiveness. Not all gave it. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I just stood, nodded once, and walked out into the daylight. Justice, it turns out, doesn't always arrive in a roar. Sometimes, it walks in on tired feet, carrying paperwork and silence. But when it comes, it stays. And that, finally, was enough. It had been 18 months since the 4 a.m. knock that started it all. A year and a half since I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, and watched the beginning of my life unravel at the hands of a weaponized HOA. Now, I stood in front of a room full of students at a small liberal arts college in Vermont. Behind me, a projector flickered with the title slide of my guest lecture, From Neighborhood Nuisance to National Movement. They didn't know the whole story, not like I lived it, but they leaned in with the kind of hunger you see when people sense something real. I began the way I always do: I didn't set out to be a symbol. I just didn't want to be bullied into opening my pool before sunrise. They laughed, as they always did. But beneath it was something deeper: understanding. Life had changed. Slowly, quietly, and then all at once. The settlement funds didn't make me rich, but they gave me breathing room. I used part of it to fix up my house. Replant the garden that Frank's boots had trampled. Rebuild the porch that held the scar from where I hit the ground. But most of the money went elsewhere. Marcus and I founded a non-profit, HOA Watch. Its mission was simple. Educate, equip, and empower residents facing abuse by overreaching homeowner associations and small-town power cliques. We opened our first legal aid clinic in Georgia. Within 6 months, we had 5 more across the country. We trained volunteers, held webinars, wrote handbooks. We testified at legislative hearings and worked with a bipartisan coalition to pass the Fair Housing Oversight Act, mandating transparency, third-party audits, and resident rights protections for all HOA-governed communities. Karen and Frank had no idea how far their actions would reach. And they never would. Occasionally, people asked if I ever saw them again. The answer was yes, once. It was a rainy afternoon in D.C. Marcus and I were invited to meet with a federal advisory council about systemic HOA reform. We stepped into the elevator at a government building, and there they were. Karen and Frank. Karen wore a government ID badge for a clerical temp agency. Frank's badge simply said, Facilities Maintenance. They didn't speak. Didn't meet my eyes. But I did something I never expected, I nodded. Not out of kindness. Out of closure. Because power had changed hands. And they no longer had any. The community changed too. New faces moved in. The new HOA president, a former librarian named Rosa Mitchell, ran things with transparency and compassion. Neighborhood potlucks replaced mandatory meetings. Kids played freely on lawns without being told their bikes were violating aesthetic codes. My neighbors spoke to me again. Waved. Asked questions. Some apologized. Some didn't need to. We all just moved forward. I even opened my pool. On my terms. One summer morning, I found a note taped to my gate. In a child's handwriting, Mr. Washington, can we swim? I brought snacks. Liam, from 2 houses down, I let him in. And a dozen more after him. Because what Karen tried to destroy was never the water. It was the community. And now, we were reclaiming it. Sometimes I sit on my new porch, repainted, stronger, and watch the neighborhood breathe. It still has scars. So do I. But we've both healed over, stronger at the broken places. Marcus likes to joke, you're the Rosa Parks of suburbia. I tell him, nah. Just a guy with a pool and a camera. But deep down, I know we did something that mattered. We exposed a quiet tyranny. We fought it with truth. And we built something better in its place. Justice didn't come in a courtroom alone. It came in the form of kids laughing in chlorine, of laws rewritten, of silence broken. That's the story I tell now. Not just what was taken, but what we took back. In every community, there's a quiet line that separates power from abuse, until someone crosses it. What started as a simple refusal to open a pool at 4 a.m. unraveled into a powerful lesson about courage, injustice, and the human cost of silence. Beneath the humor and chaos of a Karen gone rogue lies a truth that many of us know too well: the small ways we allow control, intimidation, and fear to creep into our lives can grow into something much darker when unchecked. This story isn't just about HOA rules, nosy neighbors, or outrageous accusations. It's about the strength it takes to stand your ground when everyone else looks away. It's about how truth, once exposed, can burn brighter than any lie. And it's about how each of us, whether we're retired, raising grandchildren, or simply trying to live in peace, still has the power to say, enough. Too often, we think that speaking up is for the younger generation, or that it's safer to stay quiet and let others take the fall. But the truth is, dignity doesn't come from staying silent. It comes from knowing when to stand up, not with fists, but with facts, with community, and with integrity. Whether you've faced injustice in your workplace, your neighborhood, or even within your own family, let this be a reminder. The moment you refuse to be afraid is the moment you begin to reclaim your voice. So if this story spoke to you, if it made you reflect on your own life or reminded you of someone you love, please take a moment to support this channel. Thumbs up, click that like button. Bell, subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Loudspeaker and share this video with someone who needs to hear. Justice might take time, but when it comes, it echoes.